Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Mark Almonds. I'm part of the Social Justice Committee at Corpus Christi, and we appreciate so many people joining us. I saw we're up to like 64 people, so that's wonderful. And I know about half the people that signed up were parishioners at Corpus Christi, the other half are not, so that's a great mix, and we welcome everybody. So we're excited to host this event tonight. After the tragic death of George Floyd, a number of parishioners came up with things that we can do at Corpus Christi to make changes. At the end of this forum tonight, we're going to talk about a couple of those things. We have two parishioners who will mention about a food drive and groups that we're going to be doing. But another thing, in addition to those two things, the Corpus Christi Social Justice Committee started meeting, and we wanted to organize this forum in order to educate ourselves about racial justice issues and to challenge ourselves as Catholics, as Christians, to be agents for change. We thought it'd be good to have two parishioners talk about their own experiences of racism, as well as two additional people to talk about how they've been involved in work of racial justice education. So one note is that the Zoom event will be recorded and posted on the Corpus Christi website. And now I'm going to turn it over to Deanne Stenlin, the coordinator of our Social Justice Committee. Deanne.
Hi, welcome everybody. Well, first of all, we want to welcome Father Michael Goodovich, who is going to become our new pastor starting on August 1st. And he comes to us from Milwaukee via Food for the Poor. So Father Michael, welcome. And if you could offer up a prayer for us, we'd really appreciate it.
Sure. This is I'm going to use a prayer that the Social Justice Committee uses at their meetings, I believe. So let's begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God of justice and righteousness, we ask you to help us to advocate, empowered by the strength provided by you, to imitate your compassion in this broken, hurting world. We ask you to forgive us if we have passed on the other side of those in need, hoping to avoid their intrusive claims upon our daily routine. Forgive us for using material wealth as spiritual anesthesia, and finding ourselves thus rich in things, but poor in soul. Forgive us when the enormity of injustice leaves us weary in well-doing. We ask you to widen our hearts, once stop our ears to the cries of those crying for justice. Open the eyes and ears of our lawmakers so that they may be moved to compassion for all the children, women, and men struggling with hunger and poverty. We ask you to spur our imagination, to sharpen our political will, to let us be instruments of your righteousness. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Father. And now we're going to pass it on to Michael Rios-Keating, who is the Social Justice Education Coordinator, or Manager, I guess, at Catholic Charities. So he's going to be our moderator. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, Deanne. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see some of you and to know others are here. Welcome. I see we have some individuals, some couples, and even I saw a family. So thank you for being here. Before we get started, I just want to quickly go over the format here. For some of you, this might be your first virtual forum or conversation. And so just some quick housekeeping. Like Mark said, this is going to be recorded. So that just means don't do anything on your camera you don't want to live in perpetuity. So it will be recorded. And then the way that this is going to go is I'm just going to do a quick grounding and not take up too much time because we have four amazing panelists to speak and to answer questions. And during the time that they are speaking, you can put a question that you have, if something that a panelist is saying stirs something in you, a question, and you want to make sure you don't forget, you can put the, if you hover over your screen, you'll see the chat in the bottom center. You can click that and type a message. Just make sure that under the 2, it says that it's going to everyone. And then the question will be posed to the chat, and Amy, one of the committee members, will be writing those down, so we save those for after the panelists' introductions, and then we'll get back to those questions. So for this first part, if you have a question, write it in the chat. We're going to ask that when the panelists are going, for everyone to turn off their cameras. If you have a, that helps with bandwidth to make sure that we don't get too much lag in here. So unless you are asking a question, we ask that you turn off your cameras. Once the panelist intros have happened, we'll go to the questions that were in the chat. And then at that point, we're going to transition to an open Q&A. And so you'll still be able to put questions in the chat that we'll be able to answer, but there will be one more way for you to ask a question. And if you want to ask it in person, if you want to ask the question yourself and not put it in the chat, then what you can do is raise your hand, virtually raise your hand. And in the bottom, in that same bar, if you hover over the screen, you'll see participants. If you click participants and find your name, or at the bottom of that list, you'll see an icon that says raise your hand. That will put a little icon and let myself know that you've raised your hand. I'll write your name down. I will lower your hand for you, and then I will call on you. And at that point, we would welcome to help to build community and know who's speaking. If you do raise your hand to ask a question, then I welcome you to turn on your camera to ask the question of the panelists. So once we open it for Q&A, again, you can type it in the chat, or you can go under the participants section and raise your hand, and then we'll call on you. You can turn on your camera to ask the question. So again, if we could turn off our cameras for now, and then if you have a question, we'll let you know. So I think that for the most part covers the format. If at all you are having technical difficulties, you can also put that in the chat if you need some help, and a committee member will do their best to help you through text as well. So at this point, so that is the boring grounding. But really quickly, a little bit about myself. You know, I am the moderator. We have amazing voices here, and I want to give time for that. But just some of my context before we get into this this work. I am the social justice education manager at Catholic Charities, and what I am interested in is facilitating, hosting conversations and workshops and spaces for people to really be able to bridge some of the charity work that we do, the donation work that we do, with some of the advocacy work. So bridging that charity and justice. We know that we need both things to really be doing service in the way that Catholic social teaching calls us to be. And it's hard to do advocacy if you don't feel like you know what you're advocating for, if you don't hear narratives, if you don't learn about issues. And so that's my role. And sometimes that means moderating spaces like this. My own interest, you know, we do at Catholic Charities a lot of education around housing and homelessness. But the other piece that we find ourselves in, the spaces that we find ourselves in, is racial justice spaces, because we cannot unwrap racial justice from every social justice issue. We know, unfortunately, for our clients at Catholic Charities, that they are intertwined. We know that outcomes disparities often fall on racial lines. And so we would not be doing service to our clients, our guests, our residents, if we weren't trying to address racial injustice as well. And so it is also a personal passion of mine. I think that is the space that I find myself gravitating the most. My own racial justice journey, I am still on it, but it involves some identity work that's been done for me over the last 10 years. I've been doing social justice education for about 8 years, And it was in college that I had to grapple with some of my own understandings of privilege. I identify as mixed race. My father is Mexican. My mother is white, German, Lithuanian. But I am read as white. In this world, I walk around in that way. I have blonde hair, blue eyes, but I speak Spanish, and so it gets complex. But I understand that part of that complexity is the reason why we have to continue to work on this. And so the last thing I'll say is an invitation before I introduce our panelists. And the invitation is grounded in Catholic social teaching. When we ask ourselves, why are we here? I imagine for many of us, if not for all of us, this is an issue of faith to us. We know that we're called to do this work, and we're called to listen and to serve as part of being people of faith. But Catholic social teaching in particular holds these pillars to be true, these tenets, depending on which document you're looking at, 7 or 10 pillars. But I want to call out 2 of them. And the first is community and the common good. And the reason why I want to call that out is because in my experience in this world, this is an issue. Racism is an issue that can often bring up people's defenses. You may hear something today that makes you feel uncomfortable, that makes you want to put up a wall, that makes you kind of back off and say like, whoa, I feel maybe a bit attacked with that statement or that experience. And I'm inviting you to try to get away from that individual, the individualism part of this. I think that one of the things that community and the common good as a pillar invites us into is to push against individualism and towards a communal way of being. And when we get caught in individualism, it's really easy to think about racism as just a bunch of individual people instead of a system that needs to be tackled. And so it helps me to think about community as a way to be less defensive and perhaps to hear and listen to different narratives that are different than my own. And the second pillar that I want to call out is human dignity. Human dignity is the base principle of Catholic social teaching. It is the foundational principle, believing that we do not earn dignity. We all have it inherently, being created in the image and likeness of God. And for me, it is essential for us, especially if we are white, if we identify as white, to recognize that racism does not just diminish or to not respect the dignity of people of color, but I am hurt. As a person who is read as white, I am hurt by racism. When we make it about others, it's really easy to walk away from this event and to say that it is someone else's issue. But if I can really understand where is my dignity being disrespected when racism is occurring, I think it becomes sustainable for us. So that is an invitation of grounding for today, to think about these pillars and our faith as a way of moving forward. So with that, I'm done talking, and I want to introduce our panelists. So first, I'm going to introduce them with just a tidbit about who they are, and then I'm going to invite them in order to share. Each of them are going to share, and a reminder, you can put questions in the chat. So first we have Jean-Marie Akaezu. And Jean-Marie is a parishioner at Corpus Christi. He is originally from Rwanda, which is in East Central Africa. Jean-Marie was just waving. And he's been living in the US for almost 32 years, all of them in Minnesota. He's married he's been married for 31 and a half years to Beatrice, and he has one son, Derek, who's 27 years old. Jean-Marie came to the US for school and stayed because of the civil war in Rwanda. He's been attending to Corpus Christi for 1 or 2 years now, and now has moved to Roseville. And so, Jean-Marie, thank you for being here. We also have Derek Francis, who is the manager of, if you want to wave, Derek, so we know who you are. Derek Francis is the manager of counseling services at the Minneapolis Public Schools. He is a cross-cultural counselor, educator, and trainer, and he wants you all to know that he loves God. He mentioned that he is in these spaces is a lot of times in educational spaces, but being in a faith-based spaces is also important to him. So welcome, Derek. Esther Karanja is another Corpus Christi parishioner. Esther, if you want to raise your hand. Thank you for being here, Esther. She is a parishioner. Esther works in the healthcare field, is a devout Catholic, and has also been a member of Corpus Christi as a parishioner. So you'll hear more about Esther in her time. And then lastly, we have Kevin Squira Brown. Kevin is the founding partner and full-time trainer at Cultural Fluency Associates. And he has 10 years of direct social service experience, over 20 years of teaching social work and communication courses at the collegiate level, and continues to do grassroots multicultural community organizing. And for the last 12 years, he has developed, presented, and facilitated diversity, inclusion, and cultural development work with individuals and organizations striving to live in line with their values and missions. And so that is what the expertise that Kevin brings today. So thank you, Kevin, and welcome. So I'm going to invite Jean-Marie to kick us off to share a bit about himself and his experience. We'll unmute him, and then I'll call him next. So thank you, Jean-Marie, and welcome to share.
But, thanks, Mike, and good evening, everyone. Let me start first by correcting something in my bio. I have been attending Corpus Christi studying like maybe a year or two before Corpus Christi moved to Roseville. So I'm a long time Corpus Christi member, but I live in Coon Rapids, not Roseville. So I was asked to talk about my experience with racism. And as I was thinking about what to talk about, I realized that maybe for people to understand my experience, I needed to tell you a little bit about the environments I grew up in. So I'm from Rwanda. I grew up in Rwanda, a country with a rather long history of ethnic conflicts. And I don't know about you, but I know in the dictionary, if you look up ethnicism or ethnic conflicts and racism, they are probably defined differently. But in my mind, they look and work the same way. So as far as I'm concerned. When I was in high school, that's really when I started opening to the world beyond my own country. And at that time, Rhodesia, or the former Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and South Africa, were very much in the news because of the apartheid system. And when I was in college, Soweto was burning because of the segregation system in South Africa. So when I came to this country in 1988, I had a rather heightened sense of self-consciousness of my vulnerability as far as me being a Black person, because I knew from the little we had been taught in high school about the history of slavery in this country and the not so good relationship between white and Black people in this country. So I came with kind of on my guards to avoid at all costs to get into a situation that would cause me to experience racism, so to speak. But I will get back, I'll come back to that later. But even with that history with me, when came the time to have a child, my wife and I decided that, well, we weren't gonna talk to him about racism, at least not in those terms. We just wanted him to have an experience as a human being. We didn't want him to grow up thinking that most of the people he played with, he went to school with, probably hate him because of the color of his skin. So we just consciously decided to not really talk about race at all. We would, so I hear sometimes some parents say that we had to have the talk with our son or whatever. So there was no talk with Derek, not Derek the speaker, but my son is Derek too. So really when we talked to him, even though probably in our thoughts we were talking to him about racism, but we talked in terms of, well, do what is right. If you need to do something to stand out, it better be something good. Don't stand out because of something bad you're doing. Otherwise, just blend in, respect the law to the extent that you know the law, respect it, abide by it, and all will be fine. But we didn't really talk in terms of you're Black, therefore you have to do this and that. So he came to me or to us, my wife and I, as a big surprise when I think he was probably either a junior or a sophomore in high school. This one day he came home very upset and we're like, so what's going on, Derek? He's like, at that time, so he was on the junior varsity football team for the high school. And at the beginning of the season, they would go around fundraising. And at that time they were selling, they like discount cards. It's a card that you could present at a business and get a discount agreed upon between the business and the high school. But anyway, so you would get a reward for depending on how many cards you sold. So at that time, so Derek said, well, the day did not go well for me. And we're like, well, it happens. Not everybody is going to buy whatever you're selling. So just talk to more people and you'll be fine. And he said, no, you don't understand that. They are racist. I was taken aback by that because I didn't even know he knew the word racism, to be honest. Although that was probably naive because I knew they probably studied that subject in school, in high school. So, but nonetheless, it came to me as a shock. So that was the first time we really had the talk, I guess. My hand was forced. I could not avoid it anymore. But so at that time when he said that, I said, well, how do you know they are the person who didn't buy from you is racist? I mean, they probably didn't need the card. I said, well, because my friend next door, so his friend next door, they were on the same team, about the same age. So well, after that, my friend Jake went over there and they bought a card from him. Yeah, how do you know that? Well, he told me. So he was really upset. So anyway, at that time, so we told him about relationship between white and Black in this country. And for my part, I experienced the time I was my first year and I was living in a dorm, but I realized the time is probably up. I can come back to that later, but in the interest of time, suffice to say that racism is like an insidious disease that eats you inside out and kind of erode your confidence in how you relate with other people. Think at church, before you hand over your hand for giving a peace, you wonder if the person standing next to you is going to accept your hand. I remember when I was asked to be a Eucharistic minister, I was like, whoa, what if I go up there and nobody wants to come to me? But however, at that time, I think my desire to follow in my dad's footstep, to please my dad, wherever he is at, was stronger than the fear of possibly anybody not coming to receive communion from me. But it went well, all is good. And but that has been my experience. I don't have time to talk about my wife's experience, which was interesting. But in the interest of time, I think I will get back to Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. I really appreciate that. And remember, anyone who has a question for Jean-Marie, you can put it in the chat at any time. And we will, after the panelists share, we'll get back to the questions. So thank you. Derek, again, Derek is the manager of counseling services at Minneapolis Public Schools. I'm going to turn it over to you to share with the group. Thanks, Derek.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here, and definitely see this, just the fact that there's this space for discussion, and that as an organization that you all want to have these conversations, that's huge. And so I'll share about myself, but before I do that, I want to I'll break down just understanding where we're at and the water we're swimming in, just to give us context, because I think it's so important as we dive into these conversations to understand where is it coming from, why now, and so and we got to be aware of the country that we are in, and so I gotta start us off just for folks to understand how we got here. So I think we have to be mindful of what we're dealing with in our country. So we're dealing with in our country the origin, the foundation of the country. Where it started is understanding how certain groups of people, all loved by the same God, were separated when they came here to our country. And I think we got to be mindful of just how that has impacted the souls and lives of people, and how they viewed themselves and how they were viewed here in our country, to fully understand what's going on. And so I have to share this because to know what the soul is of an African-American Black person in the U.S. means that you know the story. You know how the history involves Black people being here, brought over as slaves, and understand that we still are navigating, and in this space, the same country where African-American people were dehumanized. I mean, and this was socially accepted and also systemically upheld. So being mindful of the social environments that we're still unraveling. So we had the period where people are seen, African-American people are seen as 3/5 of humans, dehumanized through imaging, through treatment in society. And then we move on into the 1860s, where slavery is abolished, but segregation is still upheld. And so, mind you, what segregation is in our country is all humans. We're all humans on this earth here in the U.S., but we look at certain humans made from the same image of God, and we say, you know what? You don't deserve to eat where I eat. You don't drink water where I drink water. You don't go to school where my kids go to school. And you know, if you don't follow the rules, we have laws in place. So we have to be mindful of those historical pieces and to be understanding of the human conditioning and heart that segregation ended in 1960s. And so to put that into perspective, there's people in this space, if you're over 65, you were alive or born when segregation happened. I bet you there's some people here who were very much alive when segregation happened. And so we have to be aware that just because segregation ended didn't mean that people started opening up their hearts for after going 250, 300 years of seeing people with made in a darker image of God being treated It was ingrained in the mindsets. It was ingrained that they're separate. And so now we got to come back to the church and be mindful of the church, because many people say the most segregated hour is Sunday morning. And so that speaks to all of us. I think being mindful of our roles in this space, of knowing that we've had a role as a church in contributing to racism. And so I say that because it's so important for us to be mindful of the development of people growing up. And I say this because look at the church you grew up in and the dynamics of what it might have looked like. So now I begin sharing my story. I grew up here in Minnesota, Twin Cities, and I'm from the Twin Cities area, Minneapolis, Brooklyn Park, Fridley. And for me, growing up, my mom's from Liberia, West Africa, and my dad's from New York. And so growing up here in Minnesota, we most of the time in spaces and neighborhoods, one of the few people of color. And so growing up, what really saved my life is knowing that my identity, growing my identity and seeing my parents' faith in Christ, but also knowing that they taught me to see myself as someone that's loved and respected. I didn't always get that messaging when I was in school. I didn't get that messaging in society. I definitely didn't see it on the news. So I share that so that you get an understanding, especially when you see people of color, especially youth of color. When you see them, what do you see? Because I'm one of those people growing up, I'm about 6'4", tall African-American guy. When a lot of people see me, I know they don't see me as a child of God first. I know they see me as those biases and stereotypes that have been built up over 300-400 years. So I think we got to be aware of that. And so once we're aware of, all right, that's where, and that's what and I work in the schools, and we're aware that as schools, this is some of the stuff we did. Schools were segregated. Kids in neighborhoods were segregated. So we got to understand that we're doing restoration work. So up until 1964, segregation was legal. Our country did the work to keep us separated. The church, we need to step up back then. We didn't step up back then. We have to step up now. And so I share that because we see the events that are unfolding now. And I think it's important that we're able to start having these conversations as a society. And the reason why is because many people who are navigating our state, and if you do the demographic check, over half the people in our country still see themselves as believers, as Christians. But these are the same people who week in and week out go to church, and they're not aware of their racism, the microaggressions, the things that are separating us in the body of Christ. So I think it's so crucial that if you are seeing yourself as a leader of people called by God, you have to do this unifying work. Churches have been too quiet for too long, and it hurts. I've experienced church hurt myself. I remember growing up going to a predominantly African-American church. I remember the difference going to a church that was predominantly white. And the church I attend now, the intentionality to be inclusive of people of different backgrounds is so crucial, because here's the thing. We need to be the people who are advocating and putting the word out there of how to treat each other better as humans, as loved ones, see each other how God sees us. And I think that's the piece we really got to listen to our brothers and sisters that are sharing that they're hurting. We have to hear that and be honest about it, and be honest about ourselves. Like, you know what? I have to do some work on what does it look like inviting people from different backgrounds into our church? Asking yourself, well, are we being welcoming? Asking yourself, if I'm going to do donations and drop off funds, how am I actually doing life and building authentic relationships with people that look different from me? The saying came up that racism's like a cancer, and it's so true. And it's sad because it's attacking each aspect of our society, and it's attacking members in our body. And so I think it's so important that we're aware that we have to undo the things that has happened over the time period in our country around race. Racism wasn't created in just 10 years, 5 years. It's evolved over years. And I think what's added to it was just not being proactive enough. So that's what I'm really calling it for us to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Derek. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, well, there's a lot to comment in there, but remember, you can continue. We have a question, we'll save that for afterwards. But now I'm gonna ask Esther. Esther, you have the floor. Feel free to share, and we'll make sure we unmute you. So Esther, parishioner at Corpus Christi, thank you.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. My name is Esther Karanja, and I'm married and have 2 girls. I migrated from Kenya to United States in 2009. Corpus Christi have been my main parish for about 11 years now. I would like us to take this opportunity to thank the Corpus Christi parishioners and the Corpus Christi Racial Justice who invited me to this forum. Being a Catholic by faith, I have grown stronger, and also my kids have grown attending Sunday school and faith formation with other sacraments at the Corpus Christi. First, I'd like to thank the church leaders for giving Sue being the coordinator in liturgy and music, who invited us African American to come and sing and dance an African song during the Mass. I'd also like to thank the social justice team who gave me a chance to be a guest speaker at one time doing social justice. Mostly, I'd also thank all the moms in prayer group, Deb being our leader, who, us as immigrants, they really welcome us. They are open to us. We always feel welcomed, and they always show us a lot of love. And especially when we have maybe occasions at our homes, they come, they eat our African food, and they visit also with our friends when having the occasion. I remember also, I can't forget Father Fabio when I had the first communion for my child. I invited him just that morning to come and visit us when we had the African, the occasion afternoon, and he came to my house. He just told me, give me the address, and he just showed up in my house. He visited, ate, goat meat, everything, all the African food, and everyone was like, what, that is your priest? Yes, so I would like to give thanks to him for what he did. However, after migrating to the US, I adjusted to the US life. I used to hear people talk about racism, but I couldn't understand well. I was raised back home believing that if something is not yours, it is not. If it is yours, it is meant to be, but if it's not, then it's not meant to be yours. Racism is active, and as everyone has said, it is in us. Most of the African, especially those being born in Africa, experience racism, but we try to push it away or not get bothered by it. Maybe we think that we might get in trouble, so maybe sometimes we continue to associate with those people even if we know that they are racist. First example I'd like to give, like in my community, I know people who have changed their names to white sounding names, so that after they apply for the job, there are 50% of them, they receive a call back than those that sound the black sounding name. That one I have seen people do that. From my experience, at one time I work in group home, and one time one of the persons served used to be overweight. So as we were chatting about it, she asked me, what can I do? And I told her, like, you just need to eat healthy since you are fat. In Africa, in our African country, the opposite is slim is fat. So I was very new here. So I just told her that you are fat. You eat healthy because you're fat. Within no time, my supervisor called me and told me that I called the person fat. I said, okay, I'm sorry. Maybe it's my language. I'm not used to their American language. So, but that wasn't over, even though after apologizing, her mom called the house and she said that I have to apologize in front of both the mom, the supervisor, the house coordinator. I was very green in America, so I just obeyed, but I was just crying in my heart, like, what did I do? because of this. So when they came in, and I was about to apologize, and we sat together there, and they told me, then you did this before this person. But I said, no, maybe that's my language in Africa, but I wasn't meant to hurt her or something. But when we were just speaking out, unfortunately, one of the clients fell in the bathroom, and we didn't continue with the meeting. So we first took care of her. Later on, that is when her mom told me, no, don't worry about it. And I just learned that she doesn't like the everybody has to listen to what she says. So that is why they had to call me to the house. But then that didn't happen. Does racism happen in our church? I remember once in my family was sitting next to a white mass during the mass, and when it was time for peace, like the Virgin Maria said, he didn't shake our hands. He only shook those who are around us. Another time, a couple or multiple times, there have been white families, like when you get into the church, the row which you are going to sit when you just get there, they move to a different row so that they cannot just sit around you. One time again, I felt lonely when I wondered whether I'm a Black community, that this happened during the Easter hospitality in the evening. Like when I sat on my table with only me and my 2 kids. Everyone else was enjoying, but I was just there lonely with my kids. So I wondered why, because I'm a Black, that is why I should go, I don't have to associate. To conclude, God loves us all, and He wants our hearts to love everyone too. I remember Father Patrick told us that heart attack is the #1 killer in the world. In our Christian life, racism has become one of our heart killer diseases. How do we treat it? How do we overcome it? Mother Teresa said in a quote, not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. We cannot fit maybe in the senator or police, but maybe we can start with our families, in our church, in our neighbors, at home and at work, because we have all the professionals. Lastly, I would like to read what my daughter told me, Rita. I pray that, this is her quote, I pray that we may be able to achieve equality for all people in America, and that others can realize racism history and how it affects us every day. I pray to God that He will help us through this long, hard journey, because He's the only one God who can help us through this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther. And thank you for that invitation and your prayer. I really appreciate it. We're going to transition to Kevin, who is our last panelist, and Amy, again, is taking questions in the chat. So thank you for submitting them there, but we're going to unmute Kevin and hear what he has to share, and then we'll open it up for questions. So thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you. And thank you to Jean Marie and Esther and Derek for their stories and their experiences, for sharing that with us. I think it's important just to recognize the gift it is for those of us who live in whiteness to be trusted with the stories that people from diverse communities and diverse backgrounds share with us. There's pain in those stories, and too often we don't invest the same emotional sort of vulnerability that people of color, Indigenous and Black people often do and are asked to in these conversations. I want to start with acknowledging that. I use he, him pronouns. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about sort of what is whiteness, what is white supremacy, some of these terms that we use, talking around that. And then I want to make sure that I also have some time to talk about sort of my own experiences of white privilege, What does that look like for me as a white person, and how have I come to understand that? Perhaps a little bit of navigating that, but that might have to wait for the Q&A if it comes up. So a little bit of my own journey. I was born in the Midwest. I've spent most of my life in the Midwest. I spent about 10 years in Seattle. And I lived most of that time in white-centric spaces. So when I say a white-centric space, I'm talking about spaces where the vast majority of people are white, and the systems, the norms, the expectations are centered on things that come from white culture. So I've lived most of my life in white-centric spaces. Seattle was less white-centric, but still considerably white-centric. So what is whiteness? So so a little bit more my own journey. So how did I get here? It's like, well, how's a white guy doing this stuff? I've been involved in justice for a long, long time, and one of the pieces that was always difficult for me when I was doing justice work as a white male was someone who was. It seemed like the work was always like the problem was in someone else's lives. It was racism, it was sexism, it was classism, and eventually, and it took me a lot longer than I wished it had. I was introduced to the notion of systems of privilege. And privilege and racism, like white privilege and racism, are like either side of a coin. Racism is one side of the coin, and privilege and white privilege is the other side of the coin. And I would say that that white privilege actually creates racism. That it's white supremacy. It's the notion that white people are superior that creates and reinforces racism. So let me just kind of build this sort of collection of ideas and concepts one on top of each other. I'm going to start with whiteness and race. So whiteness is a term that describes a category on this scale, this hierarchy, racial hierarchy scale. It derives from the notion that there are racial categories, that they're real. We use those categories, they're not real, they're made up, they're socially created. They're not biological or scientific. As Derek pointed out, they were developed as a way a social tool to justify slavery by Europeans. They chose in their own minds to claim that the white race was superior. That superiority, they decided that they were justified, even divinely required. They got the church involved to subjugate, to assimilate, to rule people that whiteness had assigned a lower place and hence less value on this racial hierarchy scale. White supremacy is a cultural belief. And when I say it's a cultural belief, it means it's within a cultural sort of understanding of how things should be. That's what a cultural belief is. And this cultural belief, white supremacy as a cultural belief, says that white people are superior, and that all of the racism that has experienced from the transatlantic slave trade to today is somehow appropriate. It really did align significantly, as Derek suggested. It started to talk about, and Derek didn't have enough time to talk about it, I think, perhaps as much as you wanted to, Derek. But when this country was founded, and the notion of all men are created equal, Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal. At the same time, Thomas Jefferson was owning 175 to 225 slaves. There was this deep contradiction, both at the individual and at the national level in our consciousness. And in order to both continue to be a slave-owning, this country was built on slave labor. Buildings, commerce, it was built on slave labor. And in order to have that and have this ideal of all people are created equal, all men are created equal, they really did think it was just sort of white landowning men, but they sort of all men are created equal, all people are created equal. In order to hold that distinction, they had to come up with some way to meet, to deal with that contradiction. And what they said is, oh, well, Black people aren't fully people. They're not really men. They're not human. And that's that piece that Derek said. It's like Blacks are subhuman. And then with them, indigenous people, because we needed the land. The white folks needed the land. So they took the land, the genocide there. And so that's where whiteness comes from. And so racism and white supremacy are wedded to this country in ways that are unique to the US. Because our identity as a nation is driven on this idea that we hold everyone as equal, and yet at the same time our nation was built on this inequality of people. And so in order to do that, we had to live a lie. And it's a lie that we as a nation continue to embody in all kinds of ways. you know, we talk about someone mentioned earlier metaphor to medicine, and I loved that, and I'm going to take another sort of swing at that sort of thing. So in cancer, when cancer's got to stage 4, we say it's metastasized. It's gone from one form to another, from one place to another. So cancer that might have been lung cancer might show up in the lymph nodes or the kidneys or the bones of the brain. At first, it looks like a different cancer, but ultimately it's the same thing. And I would say the racism that enslaved is the racism that lynched, is the racism that calls the police on bird watchers, is the racism that kills unarmed Black men and women, but it's also the racism that says it's okay that our kids aren't being met, our needs aren't being met in the schools, and our healthcare outcomes are different, and our housing and our employment, that we can hire people based on the looks of their names and the sound of their names and the looks of their faces. That's all the same racism. And so what we're living today is the same white supremacy, the same white racism that derives from all of those very, very overt things that most white folks would say, I have nothing to do with that. It is all part of the same racism. So what's white privilege? So white privilege is everything that white people get because of their whiteness, because of my whiteness, being seen as more trustworthy and honest and safe and credible and reliable, being superior in the eyes of one another. It creates an easier and richer life. So thinking about examples, John Marie talked about the self-consciousness of being Black, not something I have to deal with. That's white privilege. Talked about the talk with his son. It's not a talk I have to have with white boys. Now I might have a different talk with females as children, but that's not a race talk. That's a gender talk. That's a gender talk, but it's a different piece. So some of these examples, 8 minutes, got a couple minutes yet. Some of these examples, like the self-consciousness, that's an internal thing. Some of white privilege lives in my internal, my intrapersonal. It's the way I carry myself and think about myself. What I'm required to either consider or think about or wonder. And we had numerous examples of that. It's also interpersonal. That's that treatment of people. Won't touch my hand, won't sit next to me. That's interpersonal. Won't hire me, doesn't want to work with me. That's interpersonal. But we also heard systemic examples. The fact that Esther's whole group, that they thought her calling someone fat was just rude. That's a cultural norm. There are a number of cultures in which calling something the way it is and using the word fat would just be a description, like saying, Kevin, you have gray in your beard. It's like, we don't consider that an insult. And in some cultures, just saying someone's fat, that's just a describer. That's just a way of defining things. But whiteness says, my cultural norms will be the expectations of everyone in the space. So Esther has to conform to white cultural norms in order to be in that space. That's a privilege that goes with being white. That's a systemic privilege. So I continue to learn. Mike mentioned sort of always learning. I'm always continuing to learn. I continue to make mistakes. We have to learn how to show up in multicultural spaces as white folks. And part of that begins with learning what our own cultural frameworks are. What are the beliefs that we've been taught as people as to what's the right way to do things, and how do we expand the notion of what's right to include other people's cultural ways as well. I'll stop there and turn it back to Mike.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. So we did get some direct questions. Before I turn it over to Amy, she's been grabbing some of those questions and she's going to ask them of panelists in order. But before, I want to to go off of something Kevin said. I heard what I like to think of as, I heard many parts of what I like to think of as this three-legged stool of the work that we have to do. There's the personal, the interpersonal, and the system, and the systematic or the systemic work. And I know that when I started this work, and still today, the interpersonal, I get caught up in as perhaps the most important, to treat others as you would like to be treated. But I encourage you to ask yourself, what did I hear that was a challenge for me to work on personally? And what was a challenge that I want to learn more about systemically? I think that we have to be treating all three legs of this stool in an equal way. And I think every panelist touched on those different pieces. So may we remember that as we move forward. So Amy's gonna ask some questions that came through, and then we'll open it up.
We do have some excellent questions. Some of them would warrant an entire forum in themselves, but I'll start with one that is specific and I think easy for Derek to start with, and that's, can you say a little bit more about microaggressions? What do you mean when you use that term, and can you give some examples? And then maybe some of the other panelists might want to talk about their personal experience with microaggression if they have an example to share as well.
Yeah, I'm glad that that question was asked, because I think it's important to understand microaggressions. I know I say this with humility to all of you. I'm no expert on the things I'm sharing with you. I'm in the process of growing. And so the way that microaggressions play out. So what microaggressions are, as a definition, would be those, and people say, term it as micro, but it definitely has a macro impact. So it's considered everyday examples of small slights, digs, or micro insults. And usually there seem to be as no harm towards a person or group. It seemed usually without fully knowing that the microaggression was said to cause harm. So it's usually a brief, commonplace, daily verbal gesture. And so microaggressions come in all different forms. One example for myself growing up of microaggressions that I would see oftentimes was in school. And so just assumptions from staff. I was a good reader. My grandma was an elementary teacher, so she helped me read, and I loved to read. But every year in school, I would have teachers that'd be like, wow, you read really well, or you do really good at math. And I'm just like, I just started noticing the overemphasis of being surprised how well I'm doing academically, or even during high school, I took a higher level class and I did a really good job on the assignment, and the teacher didn't believe I did that work. Those kind of subtle things that attack my intellect. But then there's the microaggressions against just the presence of people of color. And when I say the presence, it's just, I don't think you know how many times where I'll see someone on the elevator and it'll be just me on it, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I'm going up, and they'll not want to get on, you know. And I hope I'm not reading into it, but it's happened so much where I'm like, yeah, I know what's going on. Other types of microaggressions, it's just being in public. I have friends who are of different cultures and races and background, but when we enter spaces, knowing that sometimes that we don't get the same type of service from that other folks will get. So for instance, if we go out to a restaurant, I've seen so many times where we'll get passed up on being asked, hey, are you guys ready to be seated? Or even if I'm in line, so many times I'm in line, and usually there'll be another customer that'll say, no, he was here first, let him go. Those little things, or even just being able to just the type of neighborhood that's assumed that I live in, things like that, or even microaggressions towards the students that I work with. So many times I'll take the students of color to spaces, and instead of seeing the students as students interested, especially colleges, and I hate to say Christian colleges, the kids will go and they'll be like, based on the way kids are staring at me here, and based on the environment that people are not even engaging with us as students here on campus, we're not feeling comfortable here. So it's those little slight things where you can tell people either fearful of you and not fully embracing you as full human. And what really hurts for me, and of course then there's the police piece, I've been pulled over so many times for fitting a description. And I don't think folks, now I'm getting into the honesty of what privilege is, because if you're a white person in this country, you don't fear a pullover. And I remember my first time being pulled over with my wife, because I've been pulled over easily over 40 times. Well, between age 21 and 30, I kid you not, I was getting pulled over all the time. Me, Derek Francis, school counselor. And so I share this because a pullover stop is hard. And it wasn't always like that. But when I started realizing that I was fitting a description, when I would be pulled over multiple times within blocks of my own home or in a neighborhood, and they'd say, you fit what we're looking for. Sorry, it wasn't you. And it gets fearful because when you get stopped and you see what's going on TV and see that's how another human can be treated, it stresses me. And especially all the things on the news or in the media, those are microaggressions. You think people, I grew up not seeing positive images of myself unless it was someone on a celebrity or an athlete. I didn't have any teachers of color. I had never met a firefighter or a cop of color till college. And so I think those little daily attacks of the soul of our humanity, to be honest, it messed up my confidence in who I am. And it took a while to recover. So I think it's important to understand the identity development that comes with being a person of color, seeing yourself and other people like yourself as knowing you used to be second-class citizens in the same country. That's what the fullness of microaggressions are.
Does anyone have anything else you want to add to that? If not, I'll go through some of these other questions so we can cover more ground. This one has to do with how we reckon with the historical imagery of the church. For example, that the images of Christ look so very European, when historically that probably wasn't the case. And it's led to a skewed vision of white being equated with holiness and darker skin being associated with, at times, impurity, savageness, or a need for evangelization. And I wonder if Esther or John Marie could talk about, have you noticed anything maybe in Corpus Christi? Do we have those images? And do we need to think about changing them? Or have you seen them in other churches, and how have they made you feel? And yet you remain Catholic, and what would you share with us about that?
This is Jean-Marie. I don't recall noticing anything like that at Corpus Christi, because, and maybe that's because I have come to expect the Catholic Church to be what it is. That's what I have always seen. I have never seen different, except when I was in my country. So I'm not quite sure that I have anything to add to that. But that's really a very complex and very complex subject that could take a forum of its own to answer it. But the simple question is, you know, when you grow up, I just turned 60. For 60 years, when you see the same thing over and over, it's like almost it gets engraved in your brain, and you come to expect that's what it is. And you just.
This question has just come in, but how is Jesus and the cross portrayed in your countries back home?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What do the statues of Jesus look like in Rwanda, for example? And
yeah, they look white, just like here.
Oh, they are? Okay.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Having grown up in a Catholic faith, all I know is that Jesus is a white, that is what we have. But we might have like the rosary or the scapulas or the statues for Mother Mary. Some are black, but we don't really value whether it's black or white. What we believe is that this is just like, it's just a statue. So this is not the real image of who God is, because even nobody who knows whether he's white or black, although most of the time we value it to be in the white color. So Having grown up in most of the time, most of the things back home, they're still the same here. So I would not think it will make much of a difference, not unless there is an additional like for the Mother Mary, but I don't think there's anything that needs to be taken out. All the things that we worship in here, they're there in the church, it's just the same back home. And after all, we all believe that this is a journey, not about even the scapulars or anything. It's just the Catholic faith. It is a faith in you.
Okay.
Thank you. Kevin raised his hand. Yeah, thank you.
So I would just have us think about how did those images of Jesus come to the continent of Africa and various parts of the continent of Africa? Who was carrying those images?
Okay.
And so
most of them came from the consolata, like we have the consolata missionaries. So the ones who introduced to the Christian life, they are the ones who came with it.
Right. And so much of whiteness and much of white supremacy, hard to hear for people within faith communities, but traveled with the missionaries. The colonization and the so evangelical sort of Christianization of the world was often a same thing. And so there's a great book written by Jennifer Harvey called Dear White Christians. Jennifer Harvey writes about in this country, so it's not global, but about the white church's response in the 60s to the civil rights movement, and where it fell short, and where it fell short was in terms of being willing to share power. And it talks about reparations. So there's a question somewhere that talks about reparations, and that book also addresses that. But just important, I think, for us to recognize that whites exported the notion of Jesus as a white person, just like we exported the notion of white supremacy.
And if I may add something to that. So back in Rwanda, really, unless you are among the educated elite, racism is not a concept. It doesn't exist. Now, remember, I said that Rwanda has a history of ethnic conflict. That's one thing. Racism, as we know it here, does not exist there. As a matter of fact, Europeans, Americans, white people, they are seen as they are a subject of curiosity, but they are not. The relationship is not in terms of racism, really. At least on the side of Rwandans, they see white people as a subject of curiosity. Why are they different? Why do they look different? But they have nice things that we would like to have. So they are a subject of curiosity. So that idea of, well, why is the image of God white and not black was never really a question. That's how it was presented. That's what it was. It was accepted. As a matter of fact, was it last year or 2 years ago? I went to a wedding in San Francisco at this one church. I can't remember the name of the church, but all the imageries of God and whatnot is black. When I got there, when I saw that, I was shocked. Quite honestly, I admit it. I was like, what is this? So after so long, you kind of get used to it. You see it as, well, that's what normal looks like, I guess, and you don't question it.
Yeah,
There's probably a lot more that could be said on that topic, but let's take another question. The topic of having the talk about racism has come up a couple times tonight. And do any of the panelists have tips on when and how to have that talk with our children?
Derek. Yes, Derek, thank you.
Yeah, I'll share before I get to that, because I think it's important, especially for people on here to be mindful of, because I think sometimes that what gets lost is that people of different cultures and races experience God differently. How they view God, how they worship God, how they view God seeing them. So I think it's so important to be mindful. And I share this because you gotta imagine now what the faith looks like for people of color in our country, and how the heck that we still have faith because of the things that have gone on in the church and feeling isolated. So I think it's so important to be understanding that the way, and that's a whole tangent itself, but I noticed it because even in my wife is white, and I've grown up with up until 25 going to predominantly African American churches. And then she grew up going to predominantly white churches. And so just seeing our mindset differences, and I'll share the YouTube video because there's a woman named, she's a pastor and a counselor. Her name is Dr. Anita Phillips. And she talks about how people of color, particularly Black people, the way we experience God is more relational, more God with us. He's carried us through a lot of historical things and hears us when we cry, and we can be expressive and loud and jump. And so understanding that, and hopefully that's a nugget of information for people who may have people of different backgrounds coming in, knowing that they view and experience God different. So as far as talking about race with your kids, it's so important to understand how people come to understand race and bias. So by the age of 3 months, kids can already categorize and distinguish people based on color. They can already look at people's physical differences, and they're categorizing. As they get to 2 years old, they start to develop and understand likes, dislikes, bias. At 3 years old, kids can begin having bias and understanding racial differences and biases. And by 4 years old, kids are and they're just starting to do the research on it. There's a whole reason why they didn't, but white racial identity, white kids can begin to understand that they're white, that there's privilege that comes with it, and understand that people of different backgrounds are treated different by age 4. So before they're even in kindergarten, they're aware. And so to begin having the conversation, you have to start early. And you have to begin with your family unit and church unit, knowing what are your values, and address these situations when they come up. So you can't wait till they show up. You need to proactively teach and weave in, well, how does did Jesus die just for white people? Did he die just for a few? No, he died for all of us equally. Me too. So I think teaching kids that, help and correct them when they notice things or have errors. One of the first times a lot of kids they recognize race is when they're either in the store or shopping or somewhere. There you go, hey, that's a Black person, Mom, look. And a lot of our white families will say, shh, don't say that, don't say that, don't say that, don't say that. So you gotta stop doing that, because that makes it where they're like, okay, Mom said don't say that, we don't talk about that, leave that alone. And that's some of the work that I love doing with kids, is helping them talk about it, make it a learning opportunity. Because if they see that that's something I don't talk about, then you have it full grown. You get into, and you throw in the Minnesota nice part where we don't like dealing with conflict. Oh no, we're all the same. We're all equal. We love to hide under that, guys, but people know that is not equal. So you have to be mindful to teach your kids, you know what? I do see that you have a different background. I'll ask them to have humility to say, you know what? I've not been to the part of town you're from, or I don't have that same culture, but help me understand what's it like. How about I share with you my culture? That's how we have to help. And when they have errors, which they do, because we all do, teach them that, okay, your error doesn't mean you're a racist person, because there's always that binary of, oh, I'm a good person, there's no way I could do that racist thing. No, even good people make mistakes around race. So then we teach them, like, all right, here's how you learn about people from other backgrounds, and here's what you do when you make a mistake. So that's how we show our kids. We model it for them. And then who do you have in your own background of friendships? If you're telling yourself you want your kids to be around people of different backgrounds, and all your friends are white, all the people you have in your house are of the same race and background, then your kids they're not stupid. So it's even more important what you're saying, how you're behaving, how you're modeling, connecting with people from different backgrounds. And even those things that you say in those small pockets of close friends where you're like, oh, no one hears this. Oh, your kids hear it and they're picking up on it. So that's how you do the work of talking to your kids about race.
We do have time for one more question that I want all the panelists, but does any other panelists want to share something about talking with your children? Okay. One thing that oh, go ahead.
I agree with it because my 16 years old, the one who did the last prayer, and that one, even she knows more than me. And she sometimes come home and explains to me, and maybe I try to put it like the way I do for self-defense, but she can't because she has been, you know, she has been in America and she knows she goes to school. So it's like, no, mommy, no, this is not right. So the way you're just saying it, so we talk about it. And I actually, most of the time I listen to her rather than, you know, because she knows more than me, and sometimes I try to hide it and not think like it is racism, but she can't. She speaks out, and then I say, okay, then you need to talk to your teacher or something. So that's it's really encouraging.
Yeah, thank you. I heard someone told me once that it starts with the board books. You know, what are your children at very, very young ages intaking in terms of the people, the skin color, the cultures that they're seeing in these very small imagery, in their first kind of cartoons or imageries. And so there are plenty of resources out there. But this last question I want to pose before we wrap up with some concrete steps that we want to share that came in the form of kind of two separate questions that I'll just pose to each of the panelists, but someone asked, and perhaps Kevin, this is something you know, I'm aware of. There's a balance of not putting the burden on folks of color to continually educate those around next steps or things that you should be doing, right? Someone asked, what's something that I can say to my white acquaintance who maybe doesn't believe that they are racist? Derek, he talked about the good, bad binary. If I fall into this prejudice, I must be a bad person, and I don't believe I'm a bad person. So what is something that you can say to an acquaintance who doesn't believe that? And then another question came in addressing that sometimes some of the work that white allies want to do, try to do, if not done intentionally, thoughtfully, with the input of folks of color, can be harmful. And that there's been some critique around white saviorism in some of the allyship. So I suppose the question then is there one thing that you would share of a hope for a white person, someone who identifies as white, who is listening to this, that wants to support racial justice, wants to fight racial injustice? What is something that you would hope of them? And any order is okay.
I can go first. I take a stab at it. This is a Jean-Marie. I personally, I think I have faith that the younger generations will do away with racism. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I have faith. And just not long ago, when I was watching the news on TV, looking at the demonstrations in the street of Minneapolis, looking at the number of young white boys and girls in the crowd, just gave me hope. But I also know from experience, and this is probably something people to think about. The people who it seems like to be able to advocate for racial justice, people have to have, like, to have some sort of emotional connection to the subject. In emotional can be just have a friend, Black or some of the race, and the people who are usually subjected to racism, or probably not, it doesn't have to be a friend, just acquaintance that you talk to, you share with, and church is a good place to make those connections. And there is a program that exists or has existed for many years, Peace Corps. I can tell you from experience, people who have participated in that program, where they go abroad for volunteerism to do work, goodwill work, they don't see the rest of the world the same way. I mean, I'm talking about Americans, white Americans. They don't see the world the same way most Americans do. Once they go overseas in the third world countries, spend a year or two working with people they went to serve, make friends, make connections, they come back completely changed. I know this because, as I mentioned, when I came to this country, I was afraid to make relations, to make friends. But what really saved me, and many others like me, this one time we were the hallways of a building at the university, people from Rwanda and Burundi. We speak, the languages are almost the same. So we just chatting, talking, and this person comes and say, "Hey, you guys are speaking Kinyarwanda." There's a lady, young lady, and from there on, so she connected with us. She connected us to other people who have been there. Just that emotional connection, that personal connection, can go a long way to make a difference. You have to be emotionally invested to advocate for the cause.
Thank you. Thank you. We have 2 more minutes, so the rest of the panel is one hope.
I'd say the hope is, like was just shared, it's going to come down to first, being honest with yourself. If you're doing this work, if you want to do it, be honest. Be honest about what's in your heart. How you build relationships with people who are from different backgrounds from you. And hear the hearts and the emotions of people when they tell you, this is for real, this hurts, this is my life, this is what I've experienced. One of the most damaging things you can do is not hear when people of color are telling you this is our real experience. And so I say that because that's the first part where it starts. And then also I think it's going to take real humility and real dialogue and having conversations when it's uncomfortable and asking yourself, how are we welcoming? And if you're at a church and you haven't had this dialogue in a sermon or with colleagues or in your own home, you got to start there. What's the values of your family, and what's the values of the church in your home? What is it? Where are you all at in there? I think that's where you got to center yourself and to see each other, see all of us as how God sees us. He loves us all unconditionally, our racist parts and all. And offer yourself that knowledge that God loves you, cares about you, and he wants us to all love each other. And the best part, I'll end on this, is how he uses our differences to show us how many different varieties he is. He's like, and this is how I experience God. God, the way I experience, he's like, Derek, I have so much more to who I am than just one color, one race. So I made you all in all my images. And if you all would only just see how beautiful each aspect of me is in the fullness of the body, you'd realize how much I love all of you the same. And so I think if we start seeing each other like that, every time I have a bias in my mind, I say, well, that's God's child. he loves that person just as much as he loves me. And he wants me to love them. That's how we got to see it. And then have the love in our hearts to love our friends enough who don't realize this. Because we all got friends. And some of you got those people in your church who still say some off-color things or still come into church and you know week in and week out some of the things that are really going on in your congregation. So you got to start calling that stuff out. You can't sweep it under the rug because it might be uncomfortable for anyone. I think it's because it's so liberating for those people, if we love them, to help them realize we're all one. We got to love each other.
Thank you. One last quick thought from the others.
Yeah, I'd like to first say I'm very thankful and I'm proud that I'm still in Corpus Christi and all this has happened as being an African American, because most of the people have come and they haven't survived the white supremacy and they have left the church. You might not know it, but they have just left because they feel they are not really so much welcome. They feel they can't be able to socialize. But even though I just feel like going out, I still come back and still be at the Corpus Christi church. So I'm very grateful, and that these racism, topics, it has come out, and I'm hopeful, and I pray that we will continue. We will just be out of that zone of denial and just say, no, I'm not a racist, but it might be indirect or it might be direct, You just don't have to take a knife and kill somebody. Maybe it is in you. So you just have to pray to God that we will continue and we will treat each other equally in all ways. So God help us all.
Thank you, Esther. Kevin, 30 seconds.
I can do it. So my hope is that for those of us who present and live in whiteness, that we'd recognize that this is a journey about our own humanity. This is work about be aligning who we are with our deepest values. It isn't about doing it for someone else, which is that savior piece. This is about my integrity requires that I speak up when there's injustice, that I sort of do what I can to purge myself of that racism and the bias, and that I show up. And it isn't about other people. It's about my own journey to be the person I need to be to live with myself.
Thank you, Kevin. Now, Mark will introduce those who will close us out. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. We can give a silent applause for our panelists. Thank you.
Yes, panelists, wonderful job. Thank you so much for sharing all the insights and the wisdom. I know it touched me. And Mike, thanks for showing up with us tonight too and moderating. So, and Amy as well. Thank you all. So our very last part, we're going to talk about some action steps and resources that we put together at Corpus Christi. And we have two parishioners, Sister Stephanie Spandel and Michelle Leonard, that will talk about these things, and specifically 2 action steps that were taken at Corpus Christi. And so Michelle, can you start us off, please?
Sure. Hi, can you hear me? You can hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about we're going to start a discussion group at Corpus Christi, Stephanie and I, and I just hope it continues the conversation that is being kicked off tonight with this forum, because this will be an opportunity for people from the parishioners from the church to come together and talk about so many of the comments during the chat were topics that we could just continue talking about in small groups, and we'll bring resources to the table and different readings we can do together. And I really hope that the idea is that it's a brave, supportive, and spiritually nurturing space for us to come together and continue this conversation about how to fight and stop racism. So, thanks. I hope you consider joining.
Thanks, Michelle. As we heard this evening, our faith requires action. And Michelle just talked to us about an opportunity to do some reading and discussing together. Each on the Corpus Christi website, and also each of you will receive in the email a list that we We heard that it's important to deepen our own education and understanding of racism so that our anti-racist efforts are well-grounded, and that they don't unintentionally cause harm. And so there's a thorough list of great books, articles, and videos about pursuing racial justice in the church and in society that you'll receive through the email. Also, Corpus Christi, to this point, has collected about 20 bags of food and other essential items worth about $1,500, which has been donated to the Hallie Q. Brown Center in the Midway area, which was hard hit after the death of George Floyd. And so the need remains great. So the collections will continue and items can be dropped off in the entryway to school. As we heard from Mike, racial justice is tied to other social justice issues, and the Corpus Christi Building Action Team is currently investigating the opportunity to build affordable housing on Corpus Christi property. We're just beginning the process, and we'll be working with parishioners and the neighborhood. So again, there will be information in the bulletin and on the parish website, and you're invited to join in that effort. There will be other resources listed as well. The opportunity to join with others through Do Good Roseville, for example. So many opportunities. So I just would like to close, since our time is up, with saying that the breadth and depth of personal, interpersonal, and systemic racism, as we heard, can sometimes feel overwhelming and perhaps leave us feeling paralyzed about where to start to change. And as I mentioned, our faith calls us to action. Small actions matter as well as big ones. And being here tonight matters. We also know that this is a long journey, that anti-racist work really requires us to sustain ourselves for the long journey. This isn't something that's accomplished in months or even years. It's the work of a lifetime, and that we need God and that we need one another. So we thank you for coming this evening. May God bless and make fruitful whatever the next steps might be for you.